She was just supposed to be his secretary. He was just supposed to be her boss. But what happens when a contract written in cold ink meets two hearts still healing from the past? Claire Bennett hadn't planned to end up at Whitmore Estate, especially not as the temporary assistant to Lucas Whitmore, a man known more for his money than for his warmth. Haunted by the pain of a broken marriage and a father's failing health, Claire only needed a paycheck. Lucas, he needed control, a partner for appearances, a woman who wouldn't ask questions. But what he got was something no amount of wealth could prepare him for. So, how did a man who couldn't forgive learn to love again? And how did a woman who had lost everything find the courage to stay? 12 chapters, one impossible contract, and a love story no one saw coming. If you believe in second chances, quiet love, and the healing power of ordinary moments, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us on this unforgettable journey. Let's begin. She hadn't driven through this mountain road in over a decade. The fog was so thick she could barely see the past, let alone the future. The tires of her old Ford creaked against the damp gravel, rolling steadily through the early morning mist that curled like smoke across the ground. Every few seconds, Claire Bennett reached up to swipe the inside of the windshield, where the defroster could no longer keep up. Her breath hung in the air like quiet doubt. She had never imagined her life would come to this, 36 years old, jobless for 3 months, her father's hospital bills arriving faster than she could open them, and not a single real plan in sight. What she had was this car, a nearly empty gas tank, and a printed-out contract from a staffing agency with a name that sounded made up. It offered a temporary assistant position at an estate she hadn't even heard of until last week. But it came with room and board, and right now, the thought of hot running water and 3 meals a day felt like winning the lottery. Still, she couldn't ignore the ache in her chest, the quiet shame of it all. A decade ago, she had been a rising star at her elementary school, warm, beloved by her students, full of ideas and energy. Then came the divorce, then her father's illness, then the pandemic that shuttered her school. One by one, things had closed until all that was left was survival. She gripped the wheel a little tighter. The estate's gates appeared suddenly through the fog, tall, black iron wrapped in curling ivy, with 2 stone columns rising on either side like silent guards. As her car rolled to a stop, the intercom clicked to life. There was no voice, just a beep and the sound of metal shifting. Slowly, the gates opened. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The driveway was long, curving through rows of sloping vineyard, their leaves now fading to amber and rust. Grapevines stretched in neat lines, cloaked in morning silence. The fog pressed close around everything, making the world feel smaller, more intimate, like walking into a dream you weren't sure you were supposed to be in. When the house came into view, she slowed instinctively. It was larger than she expected, grand but not ostentatious. Weathered stone walls, steep slate roofs, and tall windows with curtains drawn tight. It looked more like an old boarding school than someone's home. Something about it made her feel like she needed to lower her voice. She parked beside a black SUV that gleamed like polished obsidian and stepped out into the cold. Her breath puffed in front of her, white and thin. She smoothed the wrinkles in her coat and grabbed her worn leather satchel from the passenger seat. The front door didn't open. Instead, a smaller side entrance clicked open behind her. A woman in her late 50s stood holding it short, composed, wearing a name tag that read, Mara. She didn't speak as Claire approached, just handed her an envelope and a set of brass keys. Inside the envelope was a typed note, Ms. Bennett. Welcome to Whitmore Estate. Your quarters are in the East Wing, 2nd floor. Please restrict your movement to staff areas unless instructed otherwise. The main house observes quiet hours after 9 p.m. Do not enter the library or upstairs study without permission. Please begin reviewing logistics for the investor event. Files are in the office down the south corridor. L. Whitmore Claire read the message twice, then looked up, half expecting someone to appear. A handshake, a voice, anything. But there was only Mara, who gestured down a long hall before walking away without a word. Inside, the estate was immaculate. High ceilings, wood floors that gleamed under her footsteps, and a stillness that bordered on unnatural. There were no family photos, no signs of life, just silence wrapped in elegance. Her room was simple but clean, a twin bed with crisp linens, a wooden desk, a single window overlooking the vineyard. She unpacked in silence, hanging the few clothes she'd brought and setting a small photo of her father on the nightstand. It was from 3 years ago, before the confusion began, back when he still remembered her birthday and the words to old hymns. Claire made her way to the south corridor. The office was exactly where the note had said. Inside were files, schedules, and a computer that thankfully still ran Windows 10. She worked in silence for hours, pausing only once to eat a cold sandwich Mara had left outside her door. The event seemed like a major dozens of guests, a media presence, tastings, interviews, all overseen by someone she had yet to meet. But that changed before midnight. A sharp knock startled her. She opened the office door, and there he was, Lucas Whitmore. He was taller than she expected lean, dressed in dark wool, with gray at his temples and sharp lines around his mouth. His eyes, though, they were ice blue and unreadable, not angry, not kind, just assessing. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake her hand. He simply held up a manila folder and said, "You cost me $250,000 in under 24 hours." Her heart dropped. She had misunderstood the delivery schedule. The client expected the shipment at dawn. Claire had marked it for noon. The truck had turned around. The deal had been canceled. She opened her mouth, closed it again. He didn't wait for excuses. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., my office. We'll discuss a different arrangement." And just like that, he was gone. Claire stood frozen in the doorway, folder in hand, the sound of his footsteps fading into the stillness. She turned back into the office, her eyes landing on the dim computer screen and the spreadsheet still open. She hadn't come here for trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had found her anyway. He wasn't just a man of numbers. He was a man who hated mistakes, and she had just made the first one. Claire sat stiffly in the armchair opposite Lucas Whitmore's desk, her palms pressed against the soft wool of her skirt, hiding the dampness. The study was silent, save for the low ticking of a vintage clock and the occasional creak of wood as the house settled in the morning chill. Lucas sat across from her, not behind the desk like a king on a throne, but in a straight-backed leather chair, as if he were conducting an interview. His legs were crossed, ankle resting on one knee, hands clasped loosely. His clothes were simple, but every detail from the monogrammed cuff of his dress shirt to the polish on his shoes spoke of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Claire had spent most of the night turning over his words in her head. "You cost me $250,000. She had tried to sleep. She couldn't. Now, in the cold light of this October morning, she felt the weight of that number like a stone in her stomach. Lucas finally broke the silence. I reviewed the order log. His voice was quiet but firm, each word placed with precision. The timestamp wasn't entirely your fault. The formatting was inconsistent. "I'll have it corrected." Claire blinked. Was that understanding? But then he added, "Still, you didn't double-check with the logistics team. You assumed. That assumption cost my family's name a headline we won't get back." And just like that, the flicker of hope inside her dimmed again. She wanted to explain, to defend herself. But something about his gaze, a cool, steel-blue stare that seemed to measure not just her answer, but her entire worth, held her still. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Ms. Bennett, do you believe you're good under pressure?" She hesitated. Then, softly, "I used to be." He nodded, once, as if logging that data point. There was no warmth in the room, just the weight of precision. He stood, walked to the window behind his desk, and looked out over the vineyards. Morning fog still clung to the rows of vines like a veil. Claire followed his gaze but couldn't read his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I don't keep people around who can't learn quickly. Her breath caught. But I also don't waste time replacing someone who's already made one mistake. If I believe they won't make a second. Claire wasn't sure if that was a threat or an invitation. Lucas turned back to face her, hands in his pockets now. There was something different in his posture, less rigid, more calculating. I have a proposition, unorthodox, but mutually beneficial. She waited. He walked back to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and placed a slim folder on the surface between them. You may have noticed, he said, that I attend certain events throughout the year, investment summits, board retreats, private estate launches. Claire nodded slowly. The industry I work in values image, stability, a sense of personal grounding, especially now. He didn't say what now meant, but his voice dipped just slightly on the word, like a stone skipping across water and sinking before she could follow it. For reasons I won't explain today, he continued, it's important that I present the appearance of a settled personal life. That includes a spouse. Claire's stomach dropped. She didn't move, didn't blink. He opened the folder. I'm offering a temporary arrangement. You'd act as my wife publicly, only in events and documents that require the illusion. The rest of the time, your responsibilities as assistant remain unchanged. She stared at him. Was he serious? Lucas sat back, arms crossed lightly. The terms are detailed in here. Financial compensation, duration, privacy clauses. You'll have time to review everything. Claire didn't reach for the folder. The room felt smaller now, not because it was physically closing in, but because this offer had changed the shape of everything. The lines between professional and personal, between logic and the surreal, blurred in an instant. Why me? She finally asked. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Recognition, pity. Because you're invisible enough to go unnoticed, but credible enough to be believed. And you don't scare easily. Her cheeks flushed, whether from insult or flattery. She wasn't sure. He stood again and walked toward the door. You have 48 hours to consider. There's no pressure to say yes. His tone said otherwise. At the threshold, he paused. But if you do, read it thoroughly. And know what you're agreeing to? Then he left soft footfalls disappearing into the hallway, leaving Claire alone with a folder, a choice, and 100 thoughts she hadn't had yesterday. She didn't touch the papers. Not yet. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, looking out through the thin glass at the vineyard. The fog was lifting slowly now, rising like a curtain to reveal what had always been there, endless rows of vines that twisted and reached, trying to find the sun even as the season changed around them. A fake wife. Of all things. She whispered the words aloud, testing how they tasted in her mouth. They didn't feel real, but neither did anything else anymore. A contract isn't supposed to tremble in your hands, but hers did. Claire sat alone at the long walnut table in the private conference room off the east wing. Morning light filtered through high windows, casting pale stripes across the floor. In front of her lay the contract, 12 pages, printed on thick ivory paper. Each line was precise, sterile, devoid of emotion, as though the idea of pretending to be someone's wife could be filed under logistics or assets. She hadn't opened it right away. She'd carried the envelope with her for most of the morning, fingers brushing its edge whenever she passed a mirror or stopped to catch her breath. It felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of pretending could already be felt, even before a single box was checked. When Lucas entered, she didn't look up immediately. He was quiet, as usual, not one to announce himself with sound. He wore a gray button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a dark watch that caught the light every time he moved. His expression was unreadable, neither stern nor warm, just watchful. He sat across from her, setting a sleek black pen down beside the folder. You've had time to review. Claire nodded, though the truth was messier. She had read the document twice, but she hadn't really absorbed it until the early hours of the morning, when the house was still and her thoughts wouldn't settle. The contract was thorough, Clause 4.2, outline joint public appearances, minimum of 4 per quarter. Clause 7.1, ensured non-disclosure of personal matters, hers or his. Clause 11.0 specified an end date, exactly 1 year from the signing. There was no mention of affection, of trust, of companionship, just image, optics, control. He waited for her to speak. She didn't. So he began, "The terms are standard for an appearance-based partnership. You're free to withdraw at any point, but if you do, certain clauses will void the payment schedule." She hated how clean it all sounded. "And if you withdraw," she asked, trying to keep her voice level. Lucas didn't flinch. "Then the contract is terminated. Compensation for time served will still be honored." Her fingers brushed the edge of the page again. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, that he'd considered everything, or that none of it seemed to matter to him personally. Finally, she asked the question that had been rising in her chest since yesterday. "Why me?" He met her gaze. No evasion, no polite lie. "You present as grounded, respectable, no social media presence, no scandals. Your family history is clear. You speak well, dress modestly, and you're adaptable, observant, quiet." Each word landed like a brick, not cruel, not untrue, but sharp in its precision, like being studied under fluorescent light. Claire swallowed. What she heard wasn't, "You're perfect." What she heard was, "You're manageable." And that hurt more than it should have. Still, she sat straighter, cleared her throat, folded her hands on the table. "I'll do it." Lucas blinked. Just once. "But," she added, voice firmer now, "on one condition." She didn't state it yet. She wanted to see his face before the words came. Wanted to know if there was even a crack in that marble exterior, some trace of reaction. But he didn't challenge her. He didn't ask what the condition was. He simply nodded, slowly, and said, "Then we'll build the revised clause into the final version." It wasn't agreement, it was acknowledgement that she wasn't just a box to check, that she was still, in some small way, a person. For the first time, his gaze didn't feel like an assessment. It felt like recognition, a flicker, barely there, but enough. She signed her name carefully, once on the signature line, once on the notarization copy. The sound of the pen scratching paper echoed louder than she expected. Lucas took the pages, placed them in a leather folder, and without a word, rose and crossed to the small safe hidden in the corner cabinet. With a few swift clicks, the safe opened. The contract went inside. The door shut. A click. And just like that, it was real. Claire stood, smoothing the skirt of her dress. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel ashamed. What she felt, most of all, was a strange stillness, as though her life had paused at the edge of something too big to name. Lucas led her down the hall, past the staff quarters, past the corridor she wasn't supposed to use before, to a guest suite near the master wing. The room was warm, bigger than the one she'd had before, a sitting area with tall windows, a fireplace, and a door that connected discreetly to the hallway outside Lucas's study. This wasn't just a promotion, it was a placement, the kind a company made to ensure access, proximity, optics. He handed her a new key, didn't say anything about the change, and as he left, she stood alone in the doorway of a space that looked more like a hotel than a home. She placed her bag down gently on the armchair by the fire, then stepped toward the window. Outside, the vineyard stretched under a sky slowly shedding its morning gray. A hawk circled overhead, then disappeared into the distant trees. Claire exhaled, long and slow, a fake marriage, to a man who chose her for being forgettable, quiet, controllable. And yet, somewhere between his careful eyes and that silent nod, she had felt just for a second seen. No one warned her that the silence in that house could be louder than any argument. Claire had lived alone before. She knew quiet well how it could soothe or suffocate, depending on the day. But the silence in Whitmore estate was different. It didn't just sit in the air. It moved. It followed. It whispered through closed doors and long, dimly lit hallways, and it carried the weight of stories left unfinished. Her new room was beautiful. Too beautiful, maybe. There were fresh flowers by the window, crisp white sheets, and heavy curtains that softened the early morning light. It all looked untouched, like a space prepared but never lived in. When she woke, it took her a moment to remember where she was and why. Breakfast was scheduled for 7:30 sharp. Not whenever you're ready. Not sometime before 9. Sharp. She found Lucas already seated at the small table in the conservatory, a pot of coffee between them, steam rising like small ghosts. He didn't look up as she entered, just gestured toward the seat across from him. The paper lay folded beside his plate, untouched. There were eggs, toast, jam in a glass dish, everything quiet. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, after a few minutes. She nodded. "Yes, thank you." Then silence again. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't warm. It simply was like everything else in the house. After breakfast, Mara appeared, as if summoned by thought alone. She handed Claire a small folder, the itinerary for the day. There was a tasting event that afternoon, a soft launch of the estate's limited vintage for a handful of private investors. Claire was to attend with Lucas, not as an assistant, but as his wife. She spent the next 2 hours preparing. Her new wardrobe had already been arranged, dresses in muted earth tones, tasteful jewelry, low heels. Lucas had clearly thought of everything. The dress she chose was soft gray, cinched at the waist, with sleeves that brushed her elbows. Simple. Safe. But when she saw herself in the mirror, she didn't quite recognize the woman looking back. The ride to the tasting was short, but quiet. Lucas drove. Claire watched the rows of grapevines slip past like waves in slow motion. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the smell of soil and coming rain. At the event, Lucas transformed. He smiled. He shook hands. He spoke in smooth, practiced tones that made investors lean in. Claire stood beside him, nodded when appropriate, made small talk when asked. She was careful, polished, her posture straight, her laugh light, her eyes always scanning the room. By the end of the hour, people were already whispering about them, the return of the elusive Lucas Whitmore, and the woman who had quietly appeared beside him. "She's poised," someone said. "A calming presence." Another added, "No one asked who she was." They assumed what they saw was the truth, and Claire didn't correct them. When they returned to the estate, the sun was already low. The sky had turned that deep, bruised purple that came just before the cold settled in. Claire took the long way back to her room. The hallways in the main house curved like a maze. Each door looked the same, tall, dark wood, brass handles, no names. But some doors, she noticed, had a different kind of silence behind them, not just unused, but sealed. One door, slightly ajar, caught her attention. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Inside, the room was dim, but not dark. Curtains were drawn, but the late light filtered through just enough to show what was there. Lavender, everywhere, in vases, in bowls, tied in bundles on the shelves. The bed was made, the books on the nightstand undisturbed, a silk scarf draped over the back of a chair. The kind of room that hadn't changed in years. Not because no one remembered it, but because someone couldn't forget. Claire backed out gently, careful not to disturb anything. She didn't ask Mara about it. She didn't ask Lucas either, but now she knew. This house had ghosts. They didn't rattle chains or whisper from corners. They sat quietly, behind doors, inside drawers, in the choice not to repaint a room. Dinner that evening was much like breakfast. Quiet, efficient. Lucas offered her wine. She accepted. He asked how she found the event. She said it went well. He nodded. They ate. At one point, their forks scraped plates at the same time, and the sound startled them both. Afterward, she returned to her room, her feet sore, her body tired from pretending to be comfortable. She sat at the vanity, took off her earrings, wiped the lipstick from her mouth. Then, from the bottom of her bag, she pulled a photo frame, It wasn't expensive, just a simple wood frame, a little chipped at the corner, inside a photo of her and her father, taken before the illness. He had a fishing hat on, and she was laughing at something he'd just said. They looked happy, whole. She placed it gently on the vanity, not hidden, not turned to the side, right in the center. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't a message, but it was, in its quiet way, a declaration I may be living in someone else's house. But I haven't disappeared. Later that night, Lucas passed by the room on his way to the library. The door was open just enough for him to glimpse inside. The frame caught his eye. He paused, just for a second, then turned away. She's not like the others, he thought. But he didn't say it out loud, not yet. It wasn't the grapes that spilled that day. It was something deeper. The harvest season had always carried a quiet rhythm on the Whitmore estate. Even in the modern age, there was something timeless about it, rows of vines heavy with fruit, the hum of machinery, the soft thump of boots on damp soil. The workers moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, each knowing their part. Claire had come down to the winery building at Lucas's request. A quick tour, he'd said. Get familiar with the process. Understand what investors would ask. She'd dressed casually, dark jeans, a linen shirt, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She hadn't expected anything more than a polite walkthrough, but life had other plans. The sound came first, a metallic clang, followed by a sharp, human cry. Claire turned toward the commotion instinctively. A young man, barely 20, was crouched beside one of the machines, his hand pressed against his palm, crimson spreading between his fingers. Another worker shouted something in Spanish, and someone ran toward the first aid station. She didn't think, she just moved. Years of classroom instincts kicked in. She knelt beside the man, her voice steady, low, calm. It's okay. Breathe. Look at me. Not the hand. He was pale, shaking. The injury looked bad, clean but deep, likely from one of the capping machines. She grabbed a clean towel from the nearby table, pressed it gently but firmly against the wound, and guided his hand above his heart. "What's your name?" she asked. Still calm. "Miguel," he whispered. "Okay, Miguel. You're going to be fine. Just keep breathing like that." When the supervisor arrived with a med kit, Claire stepped back, letting him take over, but not before giving a quick summary of what she'd done, what to watch for, and what to tell the ER nurse. Her voice didn't waver once. Miguel gave her a grateful look as they let him out. She smiled, the kind that said, "You're safe now." It wasn't until the room began to settle that she realized everyone had stopped. Dozens of eyes workers, staff, even a few vendors were looking at her with something she hadn't seen much on this estate. Respect. She turned and saw Lucas, standing in the shadow of the loading bay door, arms crossed, watching. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, but she felt the shift in him, subtle and heavy as the Oregon fog. That evening, Mara brought a small basket of thank you notes to Claire's room, simple words, written in imperfect English, from workers she hadn't even spoken to. "Gracias, Senora. You made us feel seen. No one ever steps in like that. You remind me of my mother." Claire ran her fingers over the cards, her throat tight. She hadn't done it for recognition, hadn't even thought twice. But something about those words, the quiet dignity of them, lodged deep in her chest. Later, Lucas found her in the kitchen, warming a mug of tea. "You've worked in hospitals?" he asked, casually. "No," she said, turning. She paused. Then, slowly. "When I was 23, my father had a stroke. I was the one who found him. We lived 2 hours from the nearest ER, and the phone lines were down from a storm. I had to keep him stable until help came." Lucas said nothing, just nodded. It wasn't sympathy. It was something quieter, a kind of recognition. Claire didn't offer more, and he didn't ask. But that night, something in the house felt softer. A small door, once sealed, now cracked open. The next morning, Claire received a call. She stepped out to the garden to answer it, the October wind tugging gently at her sleeves. It was the assisted living center. Her father had had a difficult night, confusion, restlessness, a fall that bruised his hip. The nurse's voice was kind but honest. He's asking for you, not with words, but he keeps looking at the door. Claire thanked her and hung up slowly. She didn't cry, she didn't panic, but something shifted in her chest. She didn't tell Lucas, not right away. Instead, she returned to the house, her face composed, her voice steady. She had learned long ago how to carry grief like a secret folded small and hidden between the ribs. That evening, just after dinner, Lucas entered her sitting room without knocking. She turned, surprised. He held out a set of car keys. "Take the black SUV," he said. "I had the staff prepare it. Full tank, coffee in the console." Claire blinked. "How did you—" "I have contacts at the care center," he said simply. "I monitor the things that matter." She didn't know what to say. No explanation, no press for emotion, just action. He handed her a coat, hers, already waiting, and a folded blanket for the car. As she stepped outside, she glanced back once. Lucas stood at the top of the steps, hands in his pockets, watching her go. No wave, no goodbye, just presence. But that presence meant more than any word. They had no contracts that day, no silence, just 2 mugs of coffee and the smell of warm bread. Claire woke before the sun touched the tops of the vineyard rows. For the first time since arriving at Whitmore Estate, there was no meeting to attend, no schedule waiting in a leather folder outside her door. Just stillness, a rare kind. The kind that asked, "What would you do if no one was watching?" She tied her hair back, slipped into soft cotton clothes, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The estate kitchen was usually run like a clock staff arriving early, timers ticking, knives clinking. But today, it was quiet, empty. Claire moved gently, as though not to disturb the walls. She found flour in a ceramic jar, yeast in the back of the pantry, and a recipe from memory, a simple loaf her grandmother once taught her to make. The dough came together slowly. She kneaded it with care, her palms pressing into the soft warmth, over and over, like a rhythm, like breathing. Coffee came next, not from the fancy machine the chef preferred, but from a chipped French press hidden in the back cupboard. She ground the beans by hand, boiled the water, waited. The scent filled the room, dark, rich, familiar. That's when she heard the soft creak of floorboards. She turned. Lucas stood at the edge of the kitchen, hair slightly mussed, wearing a dark green sweater and well-worn jeans. No suit, no mask, just a man. He looked at her, eyebrows raised slightly. "Didn't know the kitchen opened this early?" Claire smiled softly. "Only on Sundays without rules." He glanced toward the coffee. She held up a second mug. "I made extra." He stepped forward, accepted it without a word. For a moment, they just stood there, steam rising between them. The only sound the ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the oven. "You bake?" he asked, after the first sip. "Used to," she said, "when things felt more like mine." He didn't press. They sat at the small kitchen table, a place usually reserved for staff breaks, not owners and pretend spouses. Claire tore a piece of bread, passed it to him. He tasted it, then nodded quiet approval. They didn't speak much at first, but the silence wasn't cold. It was soft. She told him about her old dream, a small bookshop with a bakery in the back, shelves lined with novels, classics, children's books, the smell of cinnamon rolls and old paper, people wandering in not just to buy, but to breathe, to pause. "I even picked the name," she said, smiling a little, "The Crumb and Quill." Lucas listened, really listened. Not like a businessman gathering facts, but like a man who hadn't been invited into someone's dream in a long time. "Why didn't you do it?" he asked. She looked down at her mug. "Life," she said simply. "Debt, rent, my father." There was always something louder than the dream. He nodded. "I know the sound." That surprised her. "You," she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, looked toward the window where the light was just beginning to spill across the stone patio. "I used to paint," he said. She blinked. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Oil, watercolor, whatever I could afford back then. I wanted to go to Riezd, had a portfolio, got in, even, but my father, he didn't believe in soft professions. Said the family name came first. Legacy, wine, numbers." Claire said nothing. She just listened. "I stopped painting the day he handed me the vineyard keys. 24 years old. My mother had just passed. He said, 'Grief is a luxury. You have work to do.' The words hung in the air, not bitter, just worn. The back door creaked open then, and something small and gray darted in. A cat, skinny, dusty, cautious. It paused on the threshold, sniffed the air, then hopped lightly onto a windowsill, curling into a half-sleep. Claire stood and walked slowly toward it, crouching low. The cat didn't run, just blinked at her, as if assessing whether she was part of the furniture or not. "You again?" she said softly. "You were here yesterday, near the roses." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You've met?" She has a look. Like she owns the place, but lets us rent. He gave the smallest chuckle. Claire turned back to the cat. "I'm calling her Ash. Why? Because she looks like the last curl of smoke from a fireplace that no one sat around in years." Lucas stared at the cat, then at Claire. And for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. Not the kind he gave investors. Not the closed-lip, practiced expression that smoothed out meetings, but something real, faint, and a little sad, like someone remembering a joke from long ago. Claire sat back down. They sipped in silence for a while. Then she said it, quiet, without looking at him. "Maybe we both got stuck in lives we didn't really choose." Lucas didn't respond, not right away, but he looked at her, long and still. And for the first time his eyes didn't look like glass. They looked like water. She thought she was just there to smile and stand beside him. She didn't know she'd be the one to save him. It was still early when the car pulled onto the main road, leaving behind the vineyards of Whitmore estate. The sky over Napa was watercolor soft, brushed with pale peach and lavender, the kind of morning that made everything feel a little more possible. Claire sat beside Lucas in the back of the town car, her hands folded over her lap. She wore the olive green dress Mara had laid out the night before. Lucas hadn't said much when he picked it, just glanced once and nodded. But when she stepped into the room that morning, ready for the event, something in his eyes paused. Just a flicker, not approval, not desire, something quieter, something closer to recognition. They didn't speak much during the drive. Claire had learned not to force words where silence belonged. The suit Lucas wore was tailored to perfection. His tie a muted burgundy, polished but not showy. The look of a man in control, but control, as she had slowly come to realize, was only ever a mask, and masks always had a way of slipping. The launch event was held at a private villa tucked between rows of old vines, stone walls wrapped in ivy, strings of lights draped overhead like stars trapped in daylight. Investors, critics, and press moved through the garden with practiced charm. Claire walked beside Lucas, smile soft, posture graceful. She nodded when spoken to, laughed gently when prompted. She knew her role and she played it well. Then came the interview. A young journalist from Wine and West approached them near the tasting table, notepad in hand, polite but sharp. The kind who smiled with their mouth but questioned with their eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "your brand speaks of legacy, resilience, and rebirth. That's powerful, especially given your personal story. May I ask, do you believe in love after loss?" The question fell like a stone into still water. The conversation around them didn't pause. Glasses still clinked, laughter floated nearby. But between the two of them, Claire and Lucas, there was only stillness. His jaw tightened, eyes lowered, shoulders pulled inward, almost imperceptibly. He didn't answer, not right away, and the silence grew. The journalist shifted, sensing the tension. Claire could feel it too pressing in from all sides, threatening to collapse the fragile illusion of control. So she spoke, not from a script, not from obligation, but from something else, something older than the contract they shared. "I believe love never truly leaves," she said, voice steady, even as her fingers curled slightly at her side. "My father lost my mother when I was still a girl. For years, he couldn't even say her name without his hands shaking. But he loved her every day after she was gone. Not because he was stuck in the past, but because love doesn't stop just because someone does." The journalist blinked, surprised. Claire continued, her voice gentler now. "And one day when he was older, slower, lonelier, he met someone else. Not a replacement, just a second beginning, quieter, but still real. I think hearts know how to love again, even after they've been broken. They just don't always know they're allowed to." The air shifted. The journalist, speechless for a beat, simply nodded and scribbled something down. Others nearby, who had quietly leaned in, now looked at Claire differently, with something softer in their gaze. She hadn't planned any of it, but sometimes the unscripted moments are the only ones that matter. Later, when the event ended and the applause faded, Claire stood by herself near the fountain as the staff cleared tables. Lucas approached slowly, holding his jacket over one shoulder. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her, really looked, not like an asset, not like a convenient presence, but like someone he hadn't expected to see standing in the center of his life. They drove back in silence, not cold, just quiet. Claire looked out the window, watching the golden rose blur into the distance. Her heart was oddly steady, not racing, not anxious, just aware of what had shifted, of what couldn't be undone. When they pulled up in front of the estate gates, Lucas didn't move right away. He turned slightly toward her, eyes unreadable, voice low. "You surprised me." That was all he said. No explanation, no follow-up, just that. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. But as she stepped out of the car and the breeze caught her hair, she smiled. A small thing, but true. Because something between them had changed, and once that thread was pulled, nothing would quite fit the same again. She hadn't meant to open that door, but it opened something in him, too. It started with something as simple as a missing folder. Claire had been looking for vineyard export documents. A set of papers, Mara said, were stored in the left study on the second floor. That part of the house remained unfamiliar to her. She had been careful about boundaries, about what wasn't hers to touch. But it was broad daylight, and everything felt quiet, almost forgiving. She walked slowly down the hallway, her fingers grazing the edge of the wallpaper, noting the faint creases where time had left its marks. She turned the brass handle. The door creaked open. At first, she thought it was just another guest room, large windows, soft curtains, faint scent of lavender in the air. But something felt preserved, unmoved, the kind of stillness that didn't grow naturally, but was cultivated like a memory frozen in glass. On the dresser, there were hairpins, delicately arranged. A scarf hung on the back of a chair. A single book, Wuthering Heights, sat open-faced on the nightstand, spine cracked at the center. There was even a ceramic mug with a faded lipstick stain, as if someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Claire froze. This wasn't a room, it was a mausoleum. Then she saw it, the photo, a woman, arms around Lucas, smiling, alive. It wasn't just some past flame. This was the wife, his wife, and Claire was standing in her space. She took a slow step back, heart in her throat, eyes scanning the room for any sign of where the folder might be. But it was too late. Footsteps, fast, heavy. Then, "What are you doing?" Lucas's voice wasn't raised at first, but it cracked with something far sharper than volume. She turned to face him. His face was pale, eyes wide, not with fear, but something harder to name. His chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mara said the left study. "This isn't the study," he snapped, his voice sharp now. "Cutting. This room isn't for anyone, especially not you." Claire stepped back, stung. The "you" landed hard. He looked like a man betrayed by something unspeakable. Not anger, exactly, not grief. Some strange hybrid of both. She didn't try to explain again. There was nothing to say that would make it better. So she nodded. Just once, and walked out of the room without another word. Back in her own quarters, Claire closed the door gently, as if afraid to make a sound. She stood still in the middle of the room, hands at her sides, heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't angry, not exactly, but something in her had cracked something soft that had begun to trust him. The Lucas who smiled when she named the cat, the one who listened when she spoke about dreams and pain and books and bread. That man was gone, replaced by a cold stranger who guarded memories like a vault that no one could touch. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her hands. They were still shaking. Hours passed. She didn't go down for dinner, didn't answer when Mara knocked gently, just sat, silent, waiting for the ache to settle. Across the hall, Lucas stood in the doorway of that room, the same one he had kept exactly as she left it. Every photo remained in place. The scent of her perfume had long since faded, but he imagined he could still smell it, lavender and something sweet, like ripe pear. He walked to the dresser and picked up the photo. His hand trembled slightly as his fingers traced the outline of her smile. Her name was Elise, and she had died 3 years ago, on a cold October evening. The night before their anniversary, they had argued his fault. He forgot the date, missed dinner, missed everything. She'd driven off to her sister's place, only a few miles away. The call came an hour later. Wrong place, wrong time, a deer, a curve, a tree. He never forgave himself. And now, Claire gentle, unknowing, patient. Claire had walked straight into that sealed vault of memory, and he had barked at her like she was an intruder in a house she already belonged to more than he dared admit. Lucas sat in the chair by the window, staring at nothing. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something loosen. Not in anger. In shame. That night, Claire heard a soft sound outside her door. Not a knock, just a presence. She opened it. The hallway was empty, except for a single folded piece of paper placed carefully on the floor. She picked it up, unfolded it, recognized the handwriting instantly. It said only this: "I'm sorry. I'm still learning how to be around the living." Her hand trembled. She sat on the floor just behind the closed door, legs curled beneath her, and she cried. Not loud, not broken, just the kind of tears that come when something wounded in you is seen not with pity, but with honesty. She folded the note again, held it to her chest, and for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Estate, she didn't feel like a stranger. She felt like someone being let in, slowly, painfully, but truthfully. The problem with falling for someone under a contract is knowing when it stops being just a job. The storm rolled in just after dusk. It wasn't the kind of soft rain that lulled you to sleep. It came with a roar wind slapping against the windows, thunder crawling across the vineyard hills like a growl from something ancient. The lights flickered once, then twice, and then darkness. Claire stood in the hallway, candle in hand, when Mara's voice echoed from the kitchen. Generators out, probably the main switch. Lucas had already gone down to check. He returned 10 minutes later, wet from the rain, shirt clinging to his chest, sleeves rolled past his elbows. Claire watched silently as he pulled the fireplace gate open, stacking wood with practiced hands. No words, just the sound of kindling, the strike of a match, and a small glow growing into flame. The rest of the house was still. They sat across from each other on the rug in front of the fire, 2 wine glasses resting on the hearth. The flicker of candlelight danced on the walls, casting long shadows both warm and haunted. Claire pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping the edge of a wool blanket around her shoulders. The wine in her glass had gone warm, but she didn't care. The fire crackled, filling the silence with a kind of music only storms could make. "You ever get scared of it?" she asked, softly. Lucas turned to her. "Of what? The quiet? When everything else shuts off?" He thought for a long second. "Sometimes, not because it's empty, but because it lets everything else get louder." Claire nodded. She understood that too well. The conversation drifted, like smoke curling toward the ceiling. It was the kind of night that stripped away pretense. No titles, no contracts, just people. Two people trying to remember what being real felt like. Claire took a slow sip, then stared into the fire. "I was married once," she said. Lucas didn't react, not with surprise, not with judgment. He simply waited. His name was Andrew. We were college sweethearts, married by 24. She let the sentence hang. He left when I turned 30. Lucas leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. Claire's voice remained steady, but quiet. Said he wanted something less complicated. I'd spent so long taking care of my dad. I guess I stopped taking care of him. She laughed once, a sound with no humor. The woman he left me for sold real estate and didn't believe in aging parents moving in. Lucas didn't offer sympathy, didn't try to fix it, just listened. And that, to Claire, felt more intimate than any comfort ever could. There was a long pause. The logs popped in the fire. Then, Lucas glanced at his hand, at the silver band still circling his ring finger worn, but untarnished. "People think I wear it because I can't let go," he said. "But truth is, I just never figured out what to do with the space it would leave behind." Claire looked at him. Really looked. He wasn't cold tonight. He wasn't guarded. He looked tired, human. Like a man learning how to stand in his own skin again. The rain softened slightly, turning to a rhythmic tapping on the windows. The fire dimmed, casting a soft amber glow across Lucas's profile. Then, without warning, he turned to her, voice low, uneven. "If this contract ended tomorrow, would you stay?" The words didn't come like a test, or even a confession. They came like something raw, something pulled from a place even he didn't know still existed. Claire didn't speak, she didn't smile, didn't flinch, she just looked at him. And in that look, there were no scripts, no performances, only honesty. Honesty that ached, because the answer was tangled in everything unsaid. Because even hearts that want to leap still remember what it felt like to fall. Lucas didn't press her, he didn't need to. Instead, he looked down at his hand, at the ring, and slowly, without a word, he slid it off. It didn't make a sound, but something inside Claire broke a little anyway. Not from sadness, but from the fragile beauty of it all. Because sometimes, the most profound goodbyes aren't said to people. They're said to the person you were when you lost them. The rain kept falling, the candles flickered, and between two glasses of unfinished wine, something old was laid to rest, and something new began to breathe. She left before sunrise. No note, no goodbye, just silence where warmth used to be. It was still dark when Mara knocked gently on Lucas's study door. "Sir, she's gone." At first, he didn't move, didn't even blink. The fire in the hearth had gone cold hours ago, and the half-empty glass of wine beside him sat untouched. He had fallen asleep in the chair, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He turned his head slowly. "Gone, Miss Bennett. Her room is empty. Her suitcase, coat, all gone." Lucas stood, unsteady. The room tilted slightly as he registered her words. In the kitchen, the absence was louder than any argument could have been. No coffee, no toast warming in the oven, no soft hum of Claire reading the newspaper out loud to herself. Only stillness. Lucas stood by the counter, staring at the empty mug she usually used, one with a chipped rim she claimed gave it character. That's when he saw it, folded neatly on the back of the chair, her scarf, olive green, the one he had quietly chosen for her from a boutique in town after their first public event. She hadn't taken it with her. He reached for it slowly, fingers brushing the soft fabric, still warm from her skin, no note, no message, just gone. By midday, the storm had cleared. Sunlight spilled across the vineyard, but Lucas felt no warmth. He drove, didn't tell Mara, didn't alert the office, just took the winding road to the cabin where Claire had once taken him when her father had his last health scare. He remembered how she had sat on the porch swing, shoulders curled inward, eyes fixed on nothing. When he arrived this time, the place felt even smaller. The door was locked, curtains drawn, mailbox overflowing. He knocked, once, then twice. Nothing. The wind rustled the dry leaves in the trees. A bird took flight. But there was no sign of Claire, no sound, no trace of the warmth she had once carried like second skin. He stood on the porch longer than he needed to. Back at the estate, Lucas couldn't settle. Not in his office, not in the vineyard, not in the halls that now echoed too loudly with her absence. He avoided the kitchen. Even the cat, Ash, seemed to notice, meowing restlessly near Claire's door, then settling beneath the window as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. It wasn't until 2 days later that Mara brought in the newspaper. Local press from Sonoma. Might be something you want to see. He didn't answer at first. Just unfolded the soft, thin page with the feel of finality clinging to it. Claire Bennett, former teacher and caregiver to her late father, quietly buried her father this week in a small ceremony attended by a few close neighbors. Known for her gentle presence and steadfast care, Claire had been a quiet fixture in the local community before moving to Napa Valley earlier this year. That was all. No quotes, no photos, no flourish, just truth, simple, private, like her. Lucas held the paper in his hands for a long time, long after Mara had left, long after the sun dipped below the hills. His mind replayed every moment, her quiet laugh, the way she cradled a coffee mug like it was sacred, how she once placed a family photo on her nightstand as if to say, I belong to someone, too. He thought of the way she looked at him that night by the fire, when he asked if she would stay and she hadn't said a word. He had taken her silence as uncertainty. Now, he wondered, was it hesitation or was it fear of being the only one who'd fallen that night? Lucas walked alone down the vineyard rows. The stars were out, scattered like ash across the sky. In his hand, still, was the newspaper edges softening in the breeze. He thought he had known what grief was. He had thought it wore one face. But now, standing in the space Claire once filled with something he hadn't dared name, he realized grief didn't only come when someone died. It came when someone lived their way into your life and left without taking anything but their presence. And suddenly, that presence was everything. He didn't know how to ask her to come back. So, he bottled the question into wine. The vineyard had grown quieter since Claire left. Lucas noticed it in ways small and strange. The path from the east orchard was always swept now, though no one remembered who used to do it. The cat, Ash, spent most of its afternoons perched on the windowsill outside Claire's old room, as if still expecting the sound of her voice. The kitchen smelled only like coffee now, never like cinnamon or warm bread. Lucas worked longer hours. He told himself it was necessary, that the new distribution contracts needed oversight, that the tasting rooms needed remodeling, that the vineyard couldn't run itself. But the truth was simpler. Work was the only place her absence didn't follow him. One morning, as he walked through the fermentation room, the scent of a new barrel stopped him in his tracks. Soft, rich, lingering with notes of plum and something gentler beneath, like almond and citrus rind. Not the most complex blend, but it made him close his eyes. And he remembered her, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the softness in her voice when she told stories that mattered, how she could turn an ordinary Sunday morning into something sacred with nothing more than quiet company and a warm mug. Without thinking, he turned to his winemaker. This one, bottle it, no blending, no tweaks. Name? Lucas paused. Then he said it, the word he hadn't spoken out loud in weeks. Vintage Claire. The label was simple: cream background, hand-pressed lettering, no florals, no ornamentation, just her name. He didn't explain it to the staff, didn't mention it in marketing meetings, didn't plan a launch party, just a limited release, quiet, personal. And one bottle carefully packed was sent to a small community school 30 miles north. No note attached to the bottle, but tucked inside the box, behind the tissue paper, was a single sheet of stationery. His handwriting, slightly imperfect. It read, not as a contract, not as an obligation, just, come home. Claire didn't open the package immediately. It sat on her kitchen table for a full day before she untied the ribbon. The wine label made her breath catch. Her name, not just on the bottle, but in the way he had written the letter. No demands, no apologies, just a space held open, for her, not as a placeholder, but as a choice. She took a long walk that evening, past the school, past the bookstore she now visited weekly, into the fields that brushed the edge of her father's old property. The wind was crisp. The air carried hints of grapeskins and soil remnants of a life she had thought she left behind. But the truth was, it had followed her, lived in her skin, in the ache between her ribs when she sat alone on Sunday mornings. 2 mornings later, before the sun rose, she packed a bag, not a suitcase, just enough for a weekend, just enough to see what was still there. She didn't call ahead, didn't text, didn't announce anything, just arrived. The gravel crunched under her boots as she stepped through the vineyard path. Her coat collar pulled up against the early breeze. It had been weeks, but everything still looked the same. Almost. Lucas was in the field, notebook in one hand, inspecting vines like he always did when he needed to think. He hadn't noticed her, not yet. Claire didn't speak. She just walked until she was behind him, and then gently, quietly, placed her hand on his shoulder. Lucas froze, not in fear, not in disbelief, but in something closer to reverence. He turned, and there she was. No makeup, no carefully chosen words, no performance, just Claire. Real. Here. And she was looking at him, not with the weight of expectation, or confusion, or questions, but with softness, the kind that says, I'm still here. His eyes brimmed, no words. He didn't need them, and neither did she. They stepped into each other like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like the distance had been a necessary pause, not an end. Like the space between them had only been waiting for this moment. He wrapped his arms around her, not out of obligation, not as a symbol for anyone else, but because for the first time he could, and for the first time, she let herself lean in without wondering if she was allowed. The vines swayed gently around them. Above, the sky began to open into soft morning blue, and for a moment, the world felt still. Not perfect, but possible. The fog didn't lift overnight, but they learned to walk through it together. The vineyard in October held a different kind of beauty. The leaves had turned the color of rust and gold. Pumpkins lined the edge of the gravel path, and paper lanterns swung gently from the beams of the old pergola. The air was crisp but kind, warm enough to stay, cool enough to hold onto your sleeves just a bit longer. Claire stood near the welcome table, arranging homemade jam jars with little handwritten labels: apple cinnamon, peach and rosemary, blackberry vanilla. She had written each one in the early mornings with Ash curled at her feet, as if the cat sensed the importance of this day. It had been 1 year, one slow, quiet, complicated year. The first few weeks after her return weren't magical. There were questions unasked, wounds still sore, mornings that began in silence, and nights that ended in rooms apart. But slowly, like the vineyard through the fog, things began to reveal themselves. Lucas had learned to ask instead of assume. Claire had learned to stay, even when fear told her to run. They hadn't worn rings, they hadn't signed new contracts, but they did sign something else: the founding charter of the Bennett and Elise Foundation, a scholarship fund for young women in rural towns who dreamed of more than what life handed them. Claire had chosen the name Bennett. Lucas had chosen Elise. It felt right, like honoring the people who shaped them without being ruled by the past. The Harvest Festival had been Claire's idea. "Let's open the estate," she said one evening. "Not for buyers, not for headlines, just people, community." And so they did. Local families arrived by the dozens, children with sticky fingers, grandmothers in knitted shawls, high schoolers pretending not to be impressed. Tables were set with apple pies, mulled wine, fresh loaves, and Lucas's favorite Claire's honey cornbread. Ash supervised from the top porch step, his tail twitching like he was mayor of the whole affair. No one questioned why Claire stood beside Lucas at the greeting table. She belonged there, and not because of any title, but because this time she had chosen it. Later that afternoon, after most of the guests had wandered off to the hay rides or pumpkin painting stations, Claire slipped away quietly down a stone path that led to a small wooden cottage near the edge of the vineyard. The air inside smelled like vanilla and old books. The walls were lined with shelves, used novels, poetry, cookbooks with worn covers. A small counter near the back displayed trays of scones, cookies, and fresh loaves. A chalkboard menu in soft cursive read, "Coffee, warm bread, quiet company." Over the door, a wooden sign hung gently in the breeze. "In this life, we choose again." It was her dream, come true not in some distant city, but right here, by the rows of grapes, beside the man who once terrified her with silence and now steadied her with presence. Lucas came in near dusk. He didn't say much. He never did in moments like this. Just looked around, touched the edge of the countertop, ran his fingers across the spine of a book she'd once told him changed her life. Then he turned to her. "Did you ever imagine it like this?" Claire smiled. "No, but I'm glad I didn't. It wouldn't have felt as real." They walked back together, arms touching lightly. No need for clasped hands, just the comfort of parallel steps. The lights from the pergola glowed golden. Music floated from a distant speaker, old jazz, something warm and crackling, and in that soft, fleeting light, Claire turned to Lucas and said, "Do you remember what I told you about contracts?" He nodded. "That they don't hold feelings. They also don't hold courage," she whispered, "or grace, or second chances." He didn't answer right away, just looked at her, eyes full of every moment they had survived, every silence they had crossed, every small act that had led them here. Then he said the only thing that mattered, "Thank you for choosing again." And somewhere between the laughter of children chasing lanterns and the gentle hum of leaves brushing against the porch, Claire thought about the story they had lived, the one no one would believe if it hadn't happened, the one that could be summed up, perhaps, in a single line. The millionaire tried to control his secretary but never expected to fall. So deeply in love. Except it wasn't really about control, and she was never just a secretary. It was about two people both broken in places they didn't show learning that love wasn't about fixing or saving. It was about choosing every day, even when the fog rolls in, even when it doesn't lift, even when it hurts. And somehow, especially then, in a world that often measures worth by status, control, or appearances, this story gently reminds us that the most valuable things in life, connection, healing, love, are built not on contracts, but on courage. Claire and Lucas were never meant to fall in love. Their paths crossed through circumstance, not destiny, yet somehow, through quiet breakfasts, moments of shared pain, and long silences that spoke louder than words, they discovered something rare, the power of choosing each other, day by day. We all carry wounds, some visible, others tucked away in silent rooms of the heart. But healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a simple question. Will you stay, even when it's hard? Love, at any age, is never about perfection. It's about presence. It's about choosing again, even after disappointment. And sometimes, the most powerful love stories are the ones that begin not with fireworks, but with forgiveness. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, reminded you of something you've lived through, or simply made you feel less alone, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing heartfelt stories that heal, inspire, and connect us all. Until next time, take care and keep choosing love.